All righty. Now, last week we talked about, we spoke about several things. Excuse me. And I wanted to touch on a few of them because people have been turning stuff in. And I wanted to finish up just touch on some of the things that we didn't quite get to on the modules last week as well. And again, I'm scowling because I am looking at my screen, trying to figure out what I did. Okay, I think we'll be fine now. All right. No, it's my brain. My kids tell me my brain actually is like a pachinko machine, and a lot of the times you probably have already started noticing it. I'll be talking about things, and you'll have missed 3/4 of the conversation that I'm holding inside my head with you.
Mom says the same thing about me.
All right, that's good. Okay, what I wanted to do is talk a little bit about what things that people have been submitting, and then move on with the other stuff. One is it looks like everybody's has got it down for the attendance, where you just talk about 5 things you learned during the time we're together. And that is, you get the same points whether or not you come live. And I'm particularly grateful for Grace and Milo because it's a lot easier when there's people that I can talk to while we're doing this. And then, hey Milo, your mic is still on.
Sorry about that.
Oh, no problem at all. Okay, thank you. And everybody, and you'll get the same points whether you're live or you watch the recording, and that's fine. And I did want to remind everybody too that next week we're going to be meeting on Tuesday, and we're going to be meeting on Tuesday for the rest of the term. For those who are able to come live. And again, I really appreciate the people who are here live because it makes my job a lot easier. Then I wanted to talk about two of the other assignments that were supposed to be turned in were the weekly reflection and the submission of project ideas. Under the heading the challenge moving forward. A lot of people had really creative project ideas, and that's what I want to see. However, I did want to remind people that for projects to count for this class, they have to be addressing topics that we discuss in this class. So it needs to be 20th century art. Now, if you do something from the late 19th century, that is something we discussed that is a tie-in to preparing the world for 20th century art, that's fine, as long as it is something that we've talked about in class specifically, within the scope of this course. And when you do your project, one of the things you'll have to do is an introduction that is very clear about this is what the project covers, and it is related to this course because either the artist was working in the 20th century, or this is something that we discussed outside of the 20th century in the first module leading up to the 20th century. As long as you can say that. And that ties me into the weekly reflection. There were 3 people that turned in weekly reflections that I didn't understand how it related to the class. And actually, it was more than that. And I put a 0 on there, and I just said, before I can grade this, please tell me how it relates to class. And one person had done something on Barbie dolls. Weekly reflection. Their weekly reflection was just on Barbie dolls. And so I asked them to clarify, and they just wrote a couple sentences at the beginning, added it on, and said, hey, since we talked about the cyclic idols in the semiotics section, and we were talking about how context really impacts the meaning of art. Uh, I wanted to do it about contemporary Barbie dolls and compare them with the cycladic dolls that that looked, or the cycladic idols that from their context appear to be dolls, and that was great. Then they got a perfect score. So if you turn something in and you see a 0, before you get upset on any level, look at what I wrote down. A couple people turned in things where there were videos that were just of themselves talking about the artwork. And as we discussed last week, the video, if you're going to do a video submission for your weekly reflection, it needs to be a screen share of the artwork that you're talking about, not of you speaking. And we did talk about that pretty clearly last week. So if you turn that in and you're one of those people, um, I'm thinking that one of the easiest ways to fix that is to um, play it while your phone is focused on an image of the art. Play it so that your phone can record that sound that you already did, but the screen of the phone is recording an image of the art that you're talking about. And then I think it'll be just fine. Oh, and a couple of people did turn in something where they did the weekly reflection just fine, but they did not include an image. So I took points off of that with just a reminder, please resubmit this with the image on it. So I think that those are the main things that I wanted to talk about. Do you guys, Milo or Grace, do either of you have questions about that, about those assignments?
For the, you want 3 images, correct? For whatever we pick for our reflection.
It says 1 to 3. So if you want to just do one image, that's fine. If you want to do 3, that's fine too.
I had the like early art history class with you last semester, so I know a little bit about what's going on.
I'm sorry, what was that again?
I had the early art history class with you last semester, so I know a little bit about what's going on.
Oh, okay, all right.
Have any questions?
So yeah, you were in the prehistory to Gothic class last
Yes.
semester, right?
I couldn't quite remember what it was called.
Yeah, and it is important. The reason why I stress that is I have had students quarter into the semester still don't understand they're supposed to be doing weekly reflections on the material that we talk about in that week's module, and they've gotten kind of upset. I've had to point them to the assignment description, say this is what we're talking about. And I have also had students who would turn in things that they've done for previous classes that they've taken, which is always a bad idea. And they just had to redo it. So please pay attention to that. And again, if you don't get all the points that you want, look at what I say as to why that is so that you can go and make the changes and resubmit.
I think I did kind of have a question about the week 1 reflection.
Okay.
I know week 1, it kind of went over a lot of the different art movements throughout the period. And so I guess I was used to the last class where it was kind of separated by art period and section. And so I was wondering if it was okay to pick just any of the art pieces that we went over and not for any specific period.
Yeah, the first module includes a number of things. And one of them is the idea that there are several different art movements and how that is different from art periods. And again, if you want to do something like that from there, all you got to do is just add a couple sentences at the beginning saying, in module 1, we talked about different art movements. One of the art movements that was mentioned is this, and that's why I picked this artwork. And then it's fine. A couple people just did stuff that without that introduction, and I need to have that. So I know that you guys are, that everybody is actually paying attention to the module. So does that answer your question, Milo?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay. Now I did just surreptitiously put some candy in my mouth. It is not candy, it's medicinal to help me with my cough. And I'm very sorry that I can't share it with everybody. But that would be really difficult because we're on different sides of the computer. Anyway, I think that covers a lot of those things that I wanted to talk about. I wanted to readdress the ideas of the 4 tools of artistic critique. And then I wanted to, and that ties in with how do we look at this stuff from last week. And then one thing that I wanted to cover that we didn't have a lot of time to is just show you what that last little section of last week's module looked like. And just mention some different perspectives. Do you remember what the 4 tools of artistic critique are? The initials for them are D, A, I, and E. Do you remember what the first tool is?
I have description.
Yes, exactly right. Where we talk about the observable parameters of the art object or the object, whatever it is that we're describing. Now, if you are, say, a computer programmer or a medical professional or anything like that, that is going to be, instead of describing an art piece, you're going to be describing a situation or the setup that a patient is experiencing or something along those lines. And so this can be adapted as a critical thinking or tool for any experience that you have, where the first step is to describe what the situation is, or in our case, the art object. What's the second one that starts with A?
Analyze?
That's exactly right. And this is where we start extrapolating. How was that made? And what kinds of things did the artist do to create it? Or perhaps what are the elements that went into producing that situation the way it manifests? If you're applying this to another set of parameters. For example, looking at an art piece, is it something that looks like it's been handmade and put together, or is it extruded? Is it welded, or is it nailed together? Is it painted? If it is painted, is it spray painted? Did they use oil paints? Did they use big strokes or small strokes or dabs, or did they dribble paint? All those kinds of things go into the analysis part, where we start trying to extrapolate, like I said, how the thing that's made is made. What is the third step? It starts with I.
Is it interpretation?
Yes, exactly. And a lot of the times, I think this is a good opportunity for us to find different avenues of research and perspective. Maybe we find out that the individual who created the thing that we're looking at came from a specific background, or the object that we're looking at is not the thing that they do all the time, but something that they did just for fun. Or maybe we find out that this was a piece that was intended to protest something. Or we find out that this was a piece that was intended to inspire somebody or to be a commentary on something. An example of this, when we look at a lot of Andy Warhol's work, you get Campbell's soup can, silkscreen printing, or Marilyn Monroe. What's really interesting to me is that finding out what kind of person he was and his background, what was important to him, start realizing that he is very carefully selecting images that represent rampant commercialism of objects or people in the United States. And he is scaling them up really big and presenting them in a format that is almost identical to the iconography that was prevalent in the Renaissance. So when we take that into account, we start realizing that there is a good chance that when we look at his thing, he's not just, like he said to some reporter, oh, I use objects that already exist because it's easier. He's not just doing that. What he is doing, or what he very well could be doing, is using that iconography format to demonstrate and show a mirror to consumers that look at his artwork. These are the things that you've replaced spirituality with. You've replaced the immaterial important things with these material goods. And it's interesting that his Marilyn Monroe image is done in such a way that it is as it's formatted in a very similar way that the icons of Mary were done in the between 1350 and about 1600. And I just think that that's fascinating. But instead of making a new image of her, he used an image of her that was taken directly from a still of one of the most popular movies on the planet at the time that she was in. Not only in, but she was the face of it. She was the main marketing gimmick that the studio used. Pictures of her. And I think that kind of awareness puts a very different spin on the potential meaning for what the art is. It's no longer just doing something simple, doing something that's everybody sees just because it's simple, like Andy Warhol did tell a reporter. But maybe there's some elements of self-reflection and editorialism dealing with society. It reminds me of what Wassily Kandinsky said about the role of the artist. If you guys get a chance to look up the book, it's on Amazon. You can get a really inexpensive copy from Dover Editions. And it's Wassily Kandinsky, and I think it's The Spiritual in Art is what it's called, where he talks about that the artist has the responsibility. And he's talking, yes, he's talking about painters and sculptors and architects. But if you remember our discussion about what art is, it's any activity where you kind of engage with the flow state and forget for a moment your ego-driven self and ask for help from something beyond your normal limitations. If you look at art from that perspective, I think it's a little bit better when we hear this. But Wassily Kandinsky said that the artist becomes a prophet, and the prophet, he says, has two roles. One is to examine the culture itself and point out potential flaws and potential successes. And the other role that a prophet has is to extrapolate where the culture is being driven towards. What if the momentum of current things continue? What would the culture look like? And because the artist stands at a particularly expansive perspective point where they can see a lot more than other people who are consumed with their own activity might see. And I think that's really kind of a fascinating thing. But all those kinds of levels are tied in or are open for exploration in that interpretation, the third tool of artistic critique. Do either of you remember what the fourth tool of artistic critique is?
Evaluation.
Yeah, exactly right. And this is where we discuss whether or not something is successful. Does it fill the parameters of expectation? Is it worthwhile? And some of that is going to be, a lot of that rather, is going to be your own personal judgment. But the reason we go through these tools in that specific order is because it prepares you with the right vocabulary and the correct stacking of ideas so you can defend your position or you can justify your perspective. If somebody says, well, that's dumb, why do you think that? You're not just going to stamp your foot and say, because I said so. You can start talking about specifically the things that you described already, how the artist built them, and what they potentially mean, and how all that fits into your final evaluation. And I love being able to be articulate about why we feel a certain way about a piece of artwork is so much more satisfying than just being called on the spot and asked to justify why you like something or not. Like when I look at something like a painting by Barnett Newman, he can be considered one of the first color field painters, but it was mostly he would do a great big canvas with like a very simple vertical stripe. And you look at that work and you think, yeah, that doesn't take much thought. But then when you start finding out that Barnett Newman talked about, he was Jewish, and he loved exploring that idea of the moment of inspiration, like when the moment when Moses is in front of the burning bush and realizes that this is a representation of God, that kind of a thing, and then suddenly you realize that the painting becomes something entirely different, and it opens up an entirely new encyclopedia of possibility for understanding and helping us develop meaning associated with it. But without that kind of articulation, we're left with just saying, "Oh, I think it's pretty," which I don't know about you, but if I spend hours working on something, I put a lot of thought to it, and somebody pats me on the head and says, "Oh, it's pretty," that is not much of a compliment at all. That feels like getting kicked in the shins. It's not very pleasant. But instead, even when you're looking at your own work, if you can articulate why you like it, what about it do you like? What are the issues that you see potentially with that are different from what you intended? Those kinds of things. If you're able to articulate that, even when you're complimenting somebody, when you're able to compliment them with specifics, it is so much more satisfying. So something else to keep in mind. But I wanted to really quickly demonstrate that just with this. This is the Equate Allergy Relief Medicine bottle. And the first step is describe. This is about 2 inches high, maybe about 1.25 inches in diameter. It is primarily a white cylinder with a very short blue cylinder attached in part of it at one end. There's a paper label on it, and I look at the edges. A lot of the edges are rounded, and this is actually a removable portion of it, and the inside is hollow. So that's all description. If we go on to analyze, it looks like to me, I can feel that there's a seam here, and there's some numbers at the bottom I can feel. The lid actually has several different parts in it, and it looks like it's designed to shift around and make it a little bit more difficult to open. And so what I'm thinking is that this is all designed very specifically for injection molding, with one principal color here, the white, and another in principal color here, the blue, with a white plastic insert that's probably also injection molded, and a piece of cardboard, padded cardboard right here, to help apparently with keeping a seal here to keep this dry. So that's analyzed, talking about how it was made. Now interpreting, well, right inside of here, one thing I didn't mention is that there are little pills inside of here, and you can hear them rattling. So if I'm going to be interpreting this, I think that this is made very specifically to serve the function as a container. And because of the way that it's made, with this cardboard in here to kind of seal it and keep that moisture lock in there, it looks to me like this is designed specifically to hold the pills that the labels describes, and to hold them so that they stay usable for a much longer time than if they were just laid out or somebody holding them in their hand. And I don't know if there's much of a meaning beyond that, but I think that it does speak to an idea of a consumerist validity to the existence of the object, where the consumer is purchasing something that they intend to use over a length of time. And so I think the interpretation, what's that?
Sorry, I just wanted to also say it could also be interpreted that it's blue and white because blue is supposed to calm you down and invoke feelings of relaxation. And when you take an allergy pill, you're looking for relief and relief from your symptoms. So they might have made it blue so that you feel relief when just even looking at your allergy bottle.
Yeah, I like that. That's really good. Yeah, if this was like a neon orange lid, it would not have the same effect. So I think that's right. And I think maybe that's why the edges are a little bit softer too, you're having rounder edges also helps you to feel more calm. And having this size instead of a lot bigger, it's more accessible. You can carry it with you in case you have allergy attacks. So yeah, that's an excellent point, Grace. And then we move on to the fourth step, evaluation. Is it successful? It absolutely is successful. It is a usable, practical container that keeps the thing inside dry. And I think, like exactly what Grace says, it does. Excuse me. It is successful in implying calm and relief. So yeah, those are all really good points. Now, Milo, as Milo can attest, we will be talking about and visiting the tools of artistic critique several times during the semester. And by the end of the semester, you're going to get so tired of them, but you're going to be using those in, your real life day jobs too, just as a way of processing the information. It is a tool for systematizing critical thinking, the application of critical thinking. And that's why we're using it. And it becomes a really solid framework for looking with intent at a piece of artwork. And critical means with intent. We're not looking at something to tear it down. All too often, critique has negative associations. What I'm noticing, though, is more and more people in classes as we move forward are saying, no, criticism and critique aren't so negative anymore because they really help out. And I really appreciate that change in perspective, because when I was going to school, everybody dreaded critiques because that's when everybody told you what you sucked at. And I don't like that, because that implies that everything has to be observed in relationship to being harshly judgmental. And what we want to do is use our facilities for critical thinking to explore, appreciate, and understand something, not just tear it down. So, oh, excuse me. Okay, I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to look at this really quick here. Now, this is the last part of that first module. Now, it's titled, Where Does It Fit? And this is something that I think is really important. We cannot look at art without trying to figure out, even in our heads, how this fits with something else. And I think that when we are looking at art in order to understand it, or at the very least respect it, I think we need to look at it with intent in the scope of its historical context. What was going on at the time? And one thing that I think is really interesting, and I want everybody to watch this video, I could do that. Because my grandpa used to say anybody could do that. He'd look at the quote unquote modern art, he'd roll his eyes and say anybody could do that. Well, yes, that's true now. Once you see it, anybody can do it. But with absolutely everything that demonstrates innovation in the whole of human history, somebody somewhere had to do it first. And I really do believe that there is a lot of stuff that we look at that is contemporary art or modern art or 20th century art that at its core is probably going to be garbage. I've tried to make sure that none of the stuff that we look at in this class is like that. But when somebody is trying to quote unquote copy the Cubists and they have no idea what they're doing, they're just putting triangles and shapes down. Once you appreciate what is going on with Cubism, once you appreciate the historical context and the levels of thought that went into it, you can tell instantly that somebody is doing it just to copy the shapes and not following the rules of Cubism. And that's true for a lot of the movements that we'll look at. Once you apply your critical thinking and understand or appreciate or respect what's going on, then you can see that, yeah, anybody can do something that looks at it if you have just a shallow reading. But if you are going to apply yourself and try to mimic that down to using the rationale that people had coming from the historical context that they were, it takes a lot more thought and effort to produce it. And so that's something that I want everybody to think about. But yeah, definitely watch this video. And again, that is in module 1. So I'm going to move on to module 2 now. And just talk about this really quick. Do you folks remember what the difference between an art period and an art movement was? There's 3 principal differences.
I think one of them is that the artists in it know that they're a part of it, and in the other one, they're not so much aware.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
one is based on the one that they don't know that they're aware is sort of like a time period,
Mm-hmm.
like the 1920s or the 1930s, and then the other one is sort of like, we're a band of artists and we're creating this type of art because we believe in this, sort of.
Yeah. Yeah.
Art periods are also, they tend to be like longer and more cultural, whereas art movements tend to be shorter lasting, like only a few years.
Yeah. Those are really good. I think you got all 3 of them. The first is that art periods, generally the artist is functioning as a participant in the culture. So they are producing things that are expected by the culture. And an art movement is going to be people producing things like Grace said that are specifically reasoned. And usually they're going to be exploring uh, um, uh, a portion of the culture or the cultural beliefs, self-examination, those kinds, a lot of those kinds of things. Maybe they're responding to something that is happening. And so that is one. A period is a function of the culture, and a movement is a response to the culture. The second is, like what Milo said, periods are generally going to be generational, where they're going to last a long time, and movements are going to be shorter than a generation. A generation generally is going to be about 30 to 35 years. So an art period is going to last, like with the Egyptians, maybe 3,500 years. An art movement, like the Favis, is going to last for maybe 15 or 20 years. Okay? Or the Italian Futurists, maybe it's going to last for 5 years. And then the third, like what Grace was saying, is that an art movement is governed by artists that communicate with each other. And an art period is governed by artists within a geographical location, generally. So for the Egyptian art period, it's going to be done by Egyptian artists. For the Cubist movement, it's going to be done by German, French, and Spanish artists and American artists that are communicating with each other, that have Picasso and Braque's magazine, perhaps. They're sharing ideas, they're writing back and forth and exploring these ideas of phenomenology and shifting perspective. And so, those 3 things generally. One is what the function of the artist is. One is the length of time, and one is how the artists relate to what they're doing. Like for a period, it's geographical. For a movement, it's communication. Right. So good, very good. I'm glad you guys were awake and listening last week. Thank you very much for that. I appreciate it. Now this, I think it's really important to watch this video. It's about 7 or 8 minutes. Please watch that. And there's a couple other videos too. This is one of my favorite. I know that YouTube will block us if we watch it. This is a clip from Doctor Who, and I'll describe it when we get to it. But there are some things that are going on in the world as we come into the 20th century. Some of the things that are happening are the Industrial Revolution has kind of shifted to a technological revolution. The Industrial Revolution allowed the Impressionists and art movements to begin in the 19th century because the Industrial Revolution, by the early 1800s, had made it so that paint production was incredibly cheap, and they had metal tubes that people could store paint in, so transportation of the paint was incredibly cheap. And the Industrial Revolution is responsible for creating millions of people that had disposable income, where before that wasn't that much of a thing. And so you have a completely, a specifically and completely diverse and different um, group of people that are interested in and able to buy artwork. Instead of the artist only building stuff for institutions and people of wealth and means, now artists could explore themes that were more personal to them, that also interacted with what was popular with the middle income group that was just expanding exponentially. So all those things happened in the 19th century to really pave the way for the rapid changes that happened as we go into the 20th century. And this is really a good one. This just talks about 19th century Britain. And there are things going on around the world, but like I mentioned last week, we will be talking about that some, but the focus of this class is mostly 20th century art that takes place in the parts of the world that are interacted heavily with the Western world perspective. And that's, so I definitely watch that video. But during the 19th century, that's when photography started. I think the first photo was taken in the 1820s. And by the middle of the 19th century, by 1850, 1860, you have the cyanotype, where there was a woman who's particularly prolific, one of the true photographic geniuses of the 19th century, took cyanotypes and cataloged uh, plants and fungus and algae that grew in ponds all through Great Britain. Just particular genius. There were naturalists that refused to accept the fact that she was a woman because they could not believe a woman could be so professional, which I think is hilarious. But in the 19th century, you also have, do either of you guys want to guess who the most prolifically photographed superstar was? You know, this person was a mega superstar in the 19th century. He was the most photographed male in the world at the time. Anybody want to guess?
Was it Marilyn Monroe?
That was in the 20th century. We're talking about 19th century. It was Frederick Douglass. He was he was a slave that escaped slavery and spoke for abolition around the world. And he actually visited Abraham Lincoln 3 times. First time he thought he was a complete dunderhead. Second time he was impressed that Abraham Lincoln was actually learning. And the third time he was really impressed because not only was Abraham Lincoln learning how to be president, but he was also learning how to do the best he could for everybody that was in the United States. And but one of the things that Frederick Douglass said about photography is that for the first time in the history of the planet, it allowed everybody to have control over how the rest of the world would see them immortalized. And I just think that's amazing. In Detroit, in the last part of the 19th century, the fastest growing cottage industry were Black-owned businesses that were photography studios. Did you guys know that? And that was in a lot of the Midwest states and northern states. One of the fastest growing small businesses was for photography studios, and the people that owned them were Black Americans. But there's an interesting thing going on too. I talk about bicycle face. I don't know if you guys have ever heard about that. Have you guys ever heard of that term, bicycle face?
No, I was going
I
to.
hadn't.
So you guys, well, this is something that I think is particularly wonderful. In the mid 19th century, another thing that happened was the invention of the bicycle. And it gained very rapidly in popularity as gearing systems improved. People had a mobility that they had not had at any other time previously. Unless you were wealthy enough to own a horse that you could ride, almost everybody in Europe lived and died within 22 miles of the place they were born. And and that was the big change for that was during the Crusades. But for the most part, that everybody lived and died within a day's travel of where they were born. This is changing quite a bit through the Industrial Revolution. And then with the invention of the bicycle, suddenly there is a huge liberation of people that are at the very bottom of the middle class. The people that aren't quite desperately poor now have the means to travel, which also means that they have the means of self-determination, which I think is absolutely fantastic. What was going on at this time is middle income women were starting to wearing pants and split skirts and were riding their bicycles. And doctors started publishing articles about how there was this particular grimace that women were starting to develop that was really frightening. And it was labeled bicycle face. It was a way that the people in medical, that particularly men in medical professions, were using to decry the evils of the bicycle. And I think it seems to me that it was a way of trying to limit this growing freedom, because it did represent a fundamental shift in self-determination. Who had the right and the ability to determine their own futures. And I thought that was kind of interesting, but rather funny. And people were saying that it challenged the natural order. Whenever
When I was
yes.
Sorry, I was just gonna say when I was reading about that, it reminded me of a lot of like current beauty trends that are happening right now. Like on social media, you'll see a lot of like, oh no, I have this problem with my face, and I have this problem with my face, and it's all just like made up problems that are actually issues just to sell more beauty products. And
Right.
so when I was reading through that, I was like, oh, we really haven't changed. Like this has been going on for centuries.
Yeah, and it looks to me like the difference is, and this is just completely anecdotal, and it's only my opinion, but it looks to me like the biggest difference is the category of people that are saying that this is against the natural order. Because right now, with what you're talking about, it's the marketing professionals that are saying it's against the natural order not to use these makeup products. And in the 19th century, it was uh, people who were medical professionals that were saying this is against the natural order. But it's the same kind of made up problem, like you're saying. Yeah, I completely agree. Um, what I think is so funny to me is this phrase "natural order." When I think it was Ed Sheeran at a photo shoot where he was wearing a dress, and there were a lot of people who were saying, "Well, this is going against the natural order," and I thought that was funny because 35, no, yeah, about 4,000 years ago, the manliest men in Mesopotamia wore feathered skirts, and the most feminine women wore trousers. So, and you go to Scotland, and the manliest men still wear skirts. And I think it is hilarious the kinds of fictional labels that we slap on things to describe what we want to call natural order. What the way that we want to label the things that offend our sensibility. And it just, but this is the kind of world that is happening. A lot more people are reading. A lot more people, right? By the end of the 19th century, for the first time in, since the fall of Atlantis, people could travel all the way around the world in less than 3 months. And I say that kind of tongue in cheek. I don't know what people were like while Atlantis was in its heyday, but in recorded history, that's the fastest that anybody has ever been able to travel around the world. You start having wireless communication. You can get a message electronically delivered in a matter of hours, as opposed to weeks or months or even years. And that is what prepared the 20th century to be born. And I think it's amazing. And Pierre Auguste Renoir is the one who's credited as talking about how without paint and tubes, direct result of the Industrial Revolution, Impressionism could not have happened. And Impressionism really opened the door to all the different art movements that we're going to be visiting. And this, I really love this thing about Vincent van Gogh. I recommend everybody to watch this. I can't show it to you right now because YouTube will ding it and it won't allow me to show the video. But this is Doctor Who travels to back in time. He finds out that Vincent van Gogh has this, with his bipolar brain, he can see different colors and frequencies than everybody around him, and he helps Doctor Who to save the world. But this is before he goes really depressed and cuts off his ear and kills himself. And this Doctor Who is able to take him forward, get him to visit in a museum, and just ask the curator of the Vincent van Gogh exhibit what he thinks about the artist. And it was just a beautiful little video. Doesn't have much to do with our class, but I think it's really worth watching. So that's the idea, that the 19th century prepared the world for what folded into the 20th century, the birth of the 20th century. We're talking a little bit about Fauvism and Expressionism. And I do want to, I want to watch one of these things. This is how to look at art, and I think this is really valid. Watch this very much. And then this is who decides what art means. And I do think I want to watch this. So we're going to get past the video ad. Sigh. There we go. So I'm going to enlarge this and we're going to watch this. You guys can see this. It says TED Ed, right? You guys can see this?
Yes.
Yes, I can see it.
Okay. All right, great.
Imagine you and a friend are strolling through an art exhibit and a striking painting catches your eye. The vibrant red appears to you as a symbol of love, but your friend is convinced it's a symbol of war. And where you see stars in a romantic sky, your friend interprets global warming inducing pollutants. To settle the debate, you turn to the internet, where you read that the painting is a replica of the artist's first grade art project. Red was her favorite color, and the silver dots are fairies. You now know the exact intentions that led to the creation of this work. Are you wrong to have enjoyed it as something that the artist didn't intend? Do you enjoy it less now that you know the truth? Just how much did the artist's intention affect your interpretation of the painting? It's a question that's been tossed around by philosophers and art critics for decades, with no consensus in sight. In the mid-20th century, literary critic W.K. Wimsatt and philosopher Monroe Beardsley argued that artistic intention was irrelevant. They called this the intentional fallacy, the belief that valuing an artist's intentions was misguided. Their argument was twofold. First, the artists we study are no longer living, never recorded their intentions, or are simply unavailable to answer questions about their work. Second, even if there were a bounty of relevant information, Wimsatt and Beardsley believed that it would distract us from the qualities of the work itself. They compared art to a dessert. When you taste a pudding, the chef's intentions don't affect whether you enjoy its flavor or texture. All that matters, they said, is that the pudding works. Of course, what works for one person might not work for another. And since different interpretations appeal to different people, the silver dots in our painting could be reasonably interpreted as fairies, stars, or pollutants. By Wimsatt and Beardsley's logic, the artist's interpretation of her own work would just be one among many equally acceptable possibilities. If you find this problematic, you might be more in line with Stephen Knapp and Walter Ben Michaels, two literary theorists who rejected the intentional fallacy. They argued that an artist's intended meaning was not just one possible interpretation, but the only possible interpretation. For example, suppose you're walking along a beach and come across a series of marks in the sand that spell out a verse of poetry. Knapp and Michaels believed the poem would lose all meaning if you discovered these marks were not the work of a human being, but an odd coincidence produced by the waves. They believed an intentional creator is what makes the poem subject to understanding at all. Other thinkers advocate for a middle ground, suggesting that intention is just one piece in a larger puzzle. Contemporary philosopher Noel Carroll took this stance, arguing that an artist's intentions are relevant to their audience the same way a speaker's intentions are relevant to the person they're engaging in conversation. To understand how intentions function in conversation, Carroll said to imagine someone holding a cigarette and asking for a match. You respond by handing them a lighter, gathering that their motivation is to light their cigarette. The words they use to ask the question are important, but the intentions behind the question dictate your understanding and ultimately your response. So which end of this spectrum do you lean towards? Do you, like Wimsett and Beardsley, believe that when it comes to art, the proof should be in the pudding? Or do you think that an artist's plans and motivations for their work affect its meaning? Artistic interpretation is a complex web that will probably never offer a definitive answer. Did you know that TED-Ed has a program dedicated to sharing an...
So what do you guys think about that? Do you appreciate the idea that there is a continuum or a spectrum of where the meaning lies? And where do you think the meaning lies? And I'll give you a hint. The question itself is kind of a trick question. I'm sorry, Milo, what?
I was saying, I think it's like a healthy mix of the two. I think there's importance in the artist's intention, but it's also ultimately how your own experiences reflect how you view the world. And so that's going to change what that art means to you. But it still is important to understand what the artist was considering as well.
Yeah, I really appreciate that perspective. And that's where I fall as well. I think there are two fallacies that I noticed, or two assumptions that people are using that I don't think are appropriate. One is, in the first argument, that the artist's intentions were irrelevant. They said all the artists we study are dead. That simply is not true. And that has not been true for quite a while. Most artists that have produced work in the last 50 years are in the last 20 years per se, are still producing work. And art doesn't gain value the moment the artist has died. Art always gains value. And the other fallacy is the assumption that it can only be one or the other. And I like what you have to say, Milo, because it feels to me, and Grace, see if this resonates with you. It feels to me, since art is a methodology of communication, it feels to me that the art is best appreciated, respected, and understood if we allow it to become something of a conversation. If we allow our understanding and appreciation of the art to change as we change, like Milo, what you were saying, then we can accept the idea that the artist has their intention, whether or not we understand what that is almost immaterial to the fact that we respect the fact that they did have intention. And but the meaning that the art develops is is a product of organic growth as we interface with it over time, as we interface with our own memories of our earlier reactions to it and our earlier living with it, those kinds of things. And it will change over times as societies mature and change. or immature, as the case may be. You know, societies always go up and down. There's always this kind of cyclic change. And so Mary Shelley's The Modern Prometheus, for example, or Frankenstein, initially it was, I'm sorry, Grace, yes.
Sorry, I was just gonna say it reminds me of the conversation we were having about like, oh, I could make that, like about what your grandpa said, like, oh, I can make that. Part of what makes the pieces that people say that about, part of what makes their art is that we have conversations about it. What comes to mind
Yeah,
is like Duchamp and his like the toilet piece where it's just a
right.
urinal with his name on it. Um, that it sparked a conversation with people about what modern art is and why we value it, and the conversation is what people valued about the art piece. And I think, although yes, it didn't take much like like realistic skill for him to make that art, it did take a lot of thought for him to make it, and a lot of thought for people to converse about it.
Yeah, I think so. It took a lot of perspective, and that's, I'm glad you bring that up, because that is actually the next thing that I touch on in this module. So and that was not planned. Thank you, Grace. That was perfect. You know, this is an image, but these are dealing with art history timelines and stuff, and I would like you to look at them, particularly as it relates to the close of the 19th century and throughout the 20th century. And I talk about a lot of the kinds of things that were right on the edge there between 1895 and 1910, a lot of different styles. So go through it, and each of these videos is about 3 minutes long. So there's a lot of stuff there. But what Grace is talking about specifically is this, The Fountain by Marcel Duchamp. He wrote on it R. Mutt as the person who wrote it. Now, you look at that. I know that there are several people that are very offended that this could ever be considered art. But this is where historical context comes into line. And this is where we need, I think, to at least consider the role that the artist plays in the art. Because if we just look at this dispassionately, it is a beautifully designed urinal, but it's a urinal. I think it is a beautifully designed structure for what it is. But let's look at the historical context. At this time, um, the gallery system that began particularly in Western Europe, uh, right beginning at the beginning, right early part of the 19th century, the gallery system, this is what develops into today's ideas of style seasons, where, you know, this kind of style of sweater is so in right now, but in 6 months it's not going to be in style anymore. The gallery system was such that gallery owners would employ artists to produce art as objects to fill specifically unknown needs of potential consumers, where they would decide, okay, the colors this season are going to be blues and greens. We need a lot of pond scenes. We need a lot of water scenes. And that's what they would employ the artists to do. And if the artists were trying to do things that they felt spoke more to their own voice, there is absolutely no place for them to display that, because the gallery system was set up specifically to deliver the programmed art to the people who were told what needs they needed to be met. And Marcel Duchamp did not like that whatsoever. So at the next gallery showing, the next gallery opening, he was walking home. He found people remodeling an apartment. He went in, he picked up a discarded urinal. He painted R. Mutt in enamel on the side and the year, and then he put it on a pedestal when they set up the show. He is not displaying the urinal as art. That is almost immaterial what the object is, almost. What he is doing is like what Grace is saying, he is providing an opportunity for people to have conversations. What is art? Is it art because I put it on a pedestal and put it in a show? Is it art because the gallery has told me that this is art? Better yet, is it art because the gallery has told me this is what good art is this season? Is it art because somebody else has decided that it's art? Why don't I have a voice in deciding whether or not something is art? Is it art because it's shoved in my face, or is it art because I find it in a gallery? You know, those are the questions. But more than that, he's also asking people to embrace the potential ideas. Do I have a say in what culture is? Do I get to talk about what art is? Even is my voice relevant? And all those kinds of conversations are ones that Marcel Duchamp initiated for this. So the urinal itself is not the art piece. This becomes a symbol for a chain of thinking and conversation. And that's why
I think it,
it's important. What's that?
I'm so sorry. I think it also talks or asks questions about consumerism. Like you were saying with Andy Warhol, I think throughout the 20th century, rampant consumerism was a concern with a lot of artists, and you see that in a lot of artists' work, because they were just concerned with all of this stuff is replaceable, and that's what we're learning from the industrialization and all of this new technology that's coming about. Am I replaceable as an artist? Is my art replaceable? And I think we see that in Duchamp's work too.
Yeah, and I think that is a really good observation. Okay, Milo.
It just kind of reminds me, in another art history class, we learned about the sculpture work called A Bird in Space. And it was so controversial that the United States courts had to basically create a whole new definition for what art is, because it didn't fit their like proposed definition of what it was previously. And it was this whole big court case trying to figure out what art is.
Well, I think that is a great example too, because people are specifically engaged in that in conversation. Yeah, I like that. Now, I think it's important to know that I am not trying to advocate necessarily for any specific type of art, but I do get excited about talking about what are the potentials, what are the possibilities, how does this fit in with how people are thinking, and how does this adjust how people were thinking at the time? And I think that those kind of conversations are really important. Your guys' observations are really terrific. So please continue. I want to go down really quick. We're just going to go through this pretty fast. I would like everybody to watch these, watch at least one of these videos in each of these sections. And I think some of them only have one video. But like we look, this is Art Nouveau was right on the cusp of the change, 1890 to 1910. The reason why this is important is that this is where you start seeing heavily the influence, like what Grace was talking about, actually what both of you are talking about, that embrace of rampant consumerism that art dealt with. Alphonse Mucha and Art Nouveau was a very specific attempt to create a classically themed or styled work that could appeal to the masses. And so a lot of Art Nouveau is in marketing designs, like theater posters, advertisements for cigarette papers, different stuff like that. But it's also in everything from hairstyles to furniture design, and even silverware design, combs, commercial products, and things like that. And I think that that is a really interesting art style, like what Grace was touching on. But rather than Andy Warhol, this is an art style that is embracing the consumerism. And we look at Art Deco, and on this, I think is really fascinating because this is where people start bringing even more of that in with an altered version of revisionist history, where they bring in elements of uh, classical design, Egyptian design, Romanesque type stuff, specifically to authenticate the people that are buying the products, and which I think is really interesting. But the design, I really love the visual design sensibility of Art Deco, and I want to share this with you really quick. We can we can kind of see some of this. This is where um, people started adapting uh, previous uh, architectural and art movements that were considered classical at the time to really validate the new century. And I think it is really interesting. So definitely go through and look through there, um, those different ones. And arts and crafts is yet another perspective on the same kind of thing. And this, I want to show this to you really quick. This is this kind of style, and you can see those, like this has almost a Greek Corinthian style coil right here at the top of this. It has something that looks very much like a pomegranate um, flower petal or a lotus petal. And you can kind of see those kinds of designs in the different ways that people are doing things. It's a way of bringing in flowing natural lines into a constructed environment. And what's fascinating to me about this is, even though a lot of these things were designed specifically for consumers to consume, the artists were knowing that people were going to consume them. They were trying to create the stuff so it was beautiful as well. And I think that's really very cool. Our prairie style is kind of a specifically American take on arts and crafts and Art Deco. And what is the reason it was called prairie style is this is the Frank Lloyd Wright type stuff. And I'm going to show this to you really quick here too. Frank Lloyd Wright was like the fairy godfather of prairie style. And this is, okay, this is not prairie style. This is Rococo. So it's very different. But let's see. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought this article was a good one, and it is not helping me very much. But we are going to look at the Roby House. So the prairie style, we get a lot of these very geometric lines. We get natural stone instead of like marble, faced granite, things like that. They tried to use either natural appearing stone that was faced, or they would try to keep a little bit of the natural texture on the stone itself. But you can see the lines are very geometric, very, very angular. But there is also a specific addressing of balance in this. And when you start looking at the prairie style windows, you'll see that there's a lot of diagonal lines. There's a lot of, Frank Lloyd Wright was one of the principal architects of this. There's a lot of diagonal lines. There's a lot of this kind of feeling where this thing almost grows out of the environment, but is very balanced and geometric. And what the prairie style did specifically was use ryegrass, wheat, wisteria, ginkgo, and Japanese maple. Those 5 plants were the principal inspirations for everything that the prairie style artists did. And you can kind of see that in some of the diagonals that they used, especially in the stained glass windows. I'm going to show you some pictures of the prairie style stained glass. And I recommend very highly that you go in and look at those videos that are under each of these things, because that'll give you a lot more background. And I understand, I appreciate that we are going through this really fast, but there's a lot of stuff that we got to cover. Okay, I'm going to share this with you really quick. These are typical prairie style designs. This is a more contemporary revision, but you see this with these diagonal designs here. This is based on ryegrass. And as we look through this is more of an arts and crafts style. This is not prairie style. And the difference is, even though some people will label this prairie style, they're, the fact that it's called craftsman and slash prairie style, it comes from the same time period, but you really don't see that heavy geometric influence of the rye or the wheatgrass. And if you remember your wheat plants and rye, they have these seeds that come out of the plant diagonally, going up and away from the stalk, and that's why you have these kinds of shapes or triangle shapes, things like that. And then and I really love the ones like this where this is based on rye, and I love all these different kinds of diagonals in here, the different ways of dividing up the space, but it was designed specifically to be one of the first American art forms because it references the Great Plains and the plant abundance that is in the United States. And then we get into Impressionism. Now, one thing that is kind of frustrating to me is that most of these artists that we look at, they were not very thoughtful in participating in art movements that began and ended on specific dates. And I really think that was unconscionable because we can't say that, for example, Impressionism began on the morning of February 12th, 1879 or whatever. It is it's a gradual change in perspective where artists started giving themselves permission to paint things as they felt about them, as opposed to painting things that everybody else was expecting to see. And that's one of the reasons why you see out of focus figures and spots of color that where the person is really exploring how the water reflects and what that might look like, as opposed to making a photographic rendering of the scene. And the trees here are defined by areas of color instead of making them exact trees. And these are a little bit more realistic because you got the leaves and different things like that. But all these people, the artists are really focusing on the colors that are involved, the overall shapes, and the gesture, the emotional quality of what's going on. This is why it's called Impressionism, because the artist is focusing on showing you their impressions of the scene as opposed to showing you the scene, which I think is fantastic. So I'm backtracking a little bit. Impressionism overlaps into the 19th century, so into the 1800s. And then this video is very important for everybody to watch. It is the difference between Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, what was going on there. And so these are all really very important things to watch. Now, I do want to show you what Fauvism is. If we look at Fauvism, the name comes from an early art critic was looking at this, and he was aghast. He looked to me, he says, it looks to me that these are painted by wild beasts. He was not very impressed. What do you notice as a big difference? I'm going to switch back and forth. These are Fauvists, and this is Impressionism. What are some of the things that you are seeing that are big differences between these?
With Fauvism, like the colors are less natural and less, I guess you could argue, realistic. They're a lot more vibrant.
Yeah.
There's like a lot more focus and attention to the colors rather than just the impression.
Right. It's focusing directly with the colors, the shapes of the colors, the expression of the colors, as opposed to trying to share with you a realistic scene on any level. Yeah, that's a really good difference. What is another difference?
The in Fauvism, the contrast is like brighter, like it hits your eyes harder, I guess. Like
Yeah.
the colors are like in, if you go back towards the beginning, the that one right there, one olive trees, or no, still life. The green and the red are complementary colors, but they're being used to contrast each other. Whereas in the impressionism colors, they're using like darks and lights instead. Like the light, and in the La Grenouille, in the back, there's the dark tree, which is still like a blue tone with the light sky, which is also a blue tone.
Yeah, and I think that is, it's really, when you see these next to each other, you can see that there's a big difference. What you guys are saying, I think, is absolutely correct. There's a reason why impressionist style paintings are still very popular in hotels and motels around the world. It is a lot more easy to relax around these. And then when you find a Fauvist painting, it feels almost confrontational, where they're trying to show, not necessarily show off, but they're trying to force you to look at it because of the ways that they're using color, and it's shocking. I think the difference is between, like, here's somebody cheering their team forward and say, yeah, 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 you can do it, and then here somebody in the stands has an air horn. And do you know what I mean? Where this almost feels abrasive, but I think, yeah, you can really see a very powerful difference. So definitely watch those videos, and then we start getting into expressionism. And expressionism is something else as well, but this feels to me like it is becoming a fusion of both impressionism and Fauvism. And we can see with some of these paintings, I would argue, this is a glaring, shocking image, but the color use feels like it's not quite as confrontational as the Fauvist, while the imagery itself feels a lot more, not imagery, I'm sorry, the application of paint feels like it's a lot more gentle and soft, like Impressionism. Now, there's nothing gentle and soft about this overall image, but it feels to me like this is a really good example of how artists will sometimes do one thing, then they'll explore almost the extreme on the other side, and then they'll find something that's a fusion between the two. You've heard the pattern of critical thinking, where it's thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis, where you have an initial idea, then you have the reaction to the idea, and then you have a fusion of the two. And I think that's how expressionism feels to me, where it's harsher than the impressionists, but is a lot softer than the Fauvists. That's true for most of them. This still feels very Fauvist. It doesn't feel expressionist to me because the horses are so powerfully blue.
I feel like the forms are in the middle as well. I feel like in the Impressionists, the forms are more realistic, and in the Fauvists, they're less realistic, but in the Expressionists, sort of in the middle.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right on that count too. So that's three things we talked about: color use, shape, and overall relation to reality. Or I'm not going to say reality. I think a better word is shared expectation of reality. I think that's probably a little bit better. Now, the next part of this module is the early 20th century, and we start talking about some of these. This is a good video where both these videos are. What these videos address is there's 10 famous painters, and then it just goes through and shows several of the paintings. And I'd like you to watch these. I don't think there's any words to it. It just gives you an idea of what kinds of things we're talking about. Now, if we look at the time scale, we do have Impressionism. It is outside of the immediate scope of our class, but I think it's appropriate because it's the immediate precursor to what we are dealing with in our class. So the Impressionists, 1870 to 1890 is a pretty good range. And then that begins morphing into the Post-Impressionists. And this is where we start recognizing Van Gogh pieces as Van Gogh. And then it starts morphing into the Expressionists. You see the Post-Impressionism, 1890 to 1905, that's pretty good. This is where we really start getting into what we identify as 20th century art movements. And then Fauvism or Fauvism is very much a product of the 20th century. It is right at the beginning. Now, I think we can argue that there are still Fauvist paintings being done, and that there were even examples of Fauvism maybe being explored before this time. But this is generally the kind of year range that we're talking about. One thing that's interesting to me, remember we talked about periods are longer, movements are shorter. As we get closer and closer, notice that this Impressionism is about 20 years. Post-Impressionism is about 15 years. And Fauvism, the peak of it was about 5 years. And that's what you'll notice as we go through. Sometimes movements will last a little bit longer, sometimes they'll be shorter, but 3 to 10 years is pretty much how long most of these movements will last. And then we get to the weekly reflection. But I know that we moved really, really fast through all that. I think it's important, though, to kind of have an understanding of how we can look at the artwork. And I think it's also important to have an understanding of what kinds of things were engaging visual culture at this time, at the beginning, the moment of the beginning of the 20th century. People, our artists, for example, are giving themselves finally permission to paint things the way that they want to represent them, as opposed to, for the previous 10,000 years, they painted things generally what other people expected them to do. And with the lower cost of paint supplies and with the increased volume of different people you could potentially sell to, I think that helped the artists give themselves permission to explore this. Then you also have photography on the scene where photography, a lot of people just assumed that photography would destroy art in general, but that's not the case at all. Photography, just like AI, is just another tool for producing art. It's not going to. It doesn't replace art. It is another medium for art itself. But that allowed artists to give themselves permission to explore beyond what everybody expected. The shared reality to appear to be. But as we tie, I know that was a whirlwind, and I apologize again for it. Do you guys have any questions or observations about any of the things that we talked about? And again, please, when you're going through this, go through this module and click on the things that interest you, and look at least at several of those videos. I think most of them are only about 3 minutes long, and look at the articles. Not to necessarily read them, but look at the art, so you can kind of get an idea of what these different movements look like. One thing that impressed me is that Grace and Milo, both of you, were very definitely applying the tools of artistic critique as you were talking about the structures that appeared to identify the different artwork as belonging to specific movements. And I really appreciate seeing that. Any observations or final questions that you guys have?
I have a question. Are the length of the period of the art periods indicative of how popular they were, or not really?
That is a brilliant question. I think that a lot of the times the length of the movement, the length of a particular art movement demonstrates how interested the artists are in continuing exploring their ideas. What is it really interesting to them? Is it something that is just a product of that moment in time, or is it something that the artist has discovered that people really respond to? You know, are they actually engaging in conversations, or are they using this as their own personal branding? And I think it is going to be different for each movement as to what those answers are. I think also movements speed up as the speed of communication technology increases. When color is something that is rarely printed and has to be seen in person, then I think the movements generally might be a little bit longer. As we get to a technology where either the paintings can be shipped a lot faster, or think people can see in color more readily, like printing technology improves, then maybe that could explain why some of those movements get shorter. Or perhaps if an art movement comes as a direct result of a particular technology hitting the forefront and then going out of phase very quickly. Like it'd be interesting to see, are art movements, the length of art movements related to how popular uh, uh, direct current was, and then how quickly it got replaced by alternating current. Because that whole battle happened over the time period of the post-impressionism. So that whole battle only lasted for about 10 years. Before then, everybody was still thinking very solidly about direct current, and then Nikola Tesla was able to prove it was a lot cheaper for alternating current. Maybe that has a play in it. It does have a play in some things. If you'll notice, most popular music from about 1950 on is in the use as related to the C sharp scale. And what's interesting about that is the particular manufacture and voltage level of alternating current made it so that the hum that people barely heard in their homes from about 1950 onwards was that C sharp tone. And so it doesn't surprise me at all that popular music in every country that used alternating currents with a similar wire composition and a similar voltage output had popular music in that same kind of scale. And that's something that we can only see if we really look at the context. But Grace, I think it would be fascinating to pick a couple different movements and just try to explore, why is this one only lasted 3 years and why did this one only last 20? I think that's a really interesting question.
I just asked because in other art forms, like for example, fashion is the one that comes to mind mainly. Um, we see like in the 20th century with the rise of industrialization, and also just like, as fashion trends pick up and as more access to more fashion picks up, stuff falls out of fashion way faster. And now in the 21st century, stuff falls out of fashion in weeks, months. So, and does that have to do with popularity, or does that have to do with technology? And does that relate to art in a more...
I think the answer to all that is absolutely. It relates directly with technology. It relates directly with branding. It relates directly with people trying to market trying to build to market better, faster, and brighter than anybody else. And I think art is definitely falls in there as well, because there are artists who will respond and build art to market because they know it's selling. And there are also artists that will respond by demonstrating to people, to ask people to look at themselves and engage their own perspectives, and reflect. So there's just like Wassily Kandinsky was talking about, they're the artists that reflect their own society, and the other role is to look forward. Uh, I think artists will can only be a product of their own society, but whether they're self-reflective or build to market, that's an individual choice. So I think all those things are tied together. And I think a really good example of that is social media. We look at trends on social media. They are trends that are supposed to evaluate what people are doing, but they are also used by marketers and artists to um, kind of evaluate what they're producing themselves and define what they're producing themselves so they can feed into the expanding trends. And then also you get technology that is both reflective and reactive to that as well. So yeah, I think, Grace, that's I'm a little excited because I think that is a really excellent observation and a good perspective. That's fascinating. And I think you're right. They are related. How about you, Milo? Any last observations or questions?
I don't think so, at least not at this moment.
All right, great. Now, I'm sorry for going over that so fast, but there is a lot of stuff that we need to cover, in this first little section. And when you take 2720, we go into those impressionism, post-impressionism, and expressionism and Fauvism in quite a bit more detail. But in the meantime, please at least check on or look at those links, click on them so you can see the different artwork that is there, and just try to suck it in, because this is the visual framework that all the other, particularly Western artists, used moving forward. They were all reacting to this kind of stuff. And then by the time we get to World War II, internationally, the whole world is reacting to this kind of stuff. I say World War II because that is when the rest of the world is addressing post-colonialism, getting out of colonialism, and building their own identities, and finding that the shared language that they need to use to interact with everybody is a language that was pretty much made very popular by the Western art drivers at the time. But anyway, we'll get into that more as we go on to this semester. I hope that wasn't overwhelming to you guys, but I am looking forward to visiting with you again next week. Please, if you did not get all the points you wanted on the assignments, visit them again and either ask me a question, defend yourself, or look at what I said and respond to it and make the changes. So, all right. I hope you guys have a good week and weekend. And that is it for me for this semester. I'm just looking forward to seeing you guys. And next week, we're going to be shifting to Tuesday, and that's where we're going to be for the rest of the semester. All right?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.